Welcome to the Writer Talks. How has your week been? Mine has been thrilling as I traveled vicariously to Haiti with the US Marines, watched things unfold on the Capitol Hill, witnessed exposés of internet fraud, and discussed the possibility of chips being embedded in high net worth individuals, the business tycoons. How? Thanks to my interaction with the perfect gentleman, former political journalist who worked at the Capitol Hill and at the White House for nearly 13 years, former head of corporate communications at Cisco, consulted for tech and entertainment companies, founder of an internet safety group involved in exposing illegal gambling such as the sketchy Sweepstake Cafes, and most importantly, a prolific writer who has authored numerous open editorials and short stories besides his exciting, soon to be published novel, The Auction. Tom Galvin, all the way from US. Tom is one of the most encouraging mentors on the writing community on Twitter, and he's also one of the most exciting people to talk to. His regularly insightful questions about writing processes, such as the Technique Talk Tuesday, wherein he asks, do you start your novel with a clear understanding of the intention and obstacles of your main character, the obstacles that your main characters will face, or do you discover them as you write? Tell us how you write. Such questions enable writers, both seasoned as well as new writers, to connect and learn from one another. Watch Tom discuss his writing process, his exciting experiences as a political journalist, his unique and challenging moments when he accompanied the Marines to Haiti, wherein he had a gun pointed at him, but is still candid and grounded enough to tell me that he is averse to sensationalism and cannot overstate the risks he faced. Watch him as he moves on seamlessly to discuss his enduring passion for writing and the inspiration behind his novel, The Auction. Without further ado, let's dive in and listen to the enthralling experiences of this prolific writer, Tom Galvin, in the first part of my conversation with him. But before that, please like, share, and subscribe to the Writer Talks. Show your support by getting more subscribers so that we can continue such literary engagement with brilliant writers from across the world. Do write in your thoughts and comments in the comments section below. Now, until next week, write, hone your technique, pursue your passion, and take care. Enjoy the conversation. Ahoy! Ahoy! On the Writer Talks with me today, we have the very distinguished former political journalist, former corporate communications head at Cisco, and most significantly, a brilliant writer, Thomas Galvin, all the way from US. Hello, Tom.
Well, from the US, I just want to say it's an honor and privilege to be here with you, and thank you so much for the invitation.
It's completely my pleasure, Tom. Good morning. Good morning from India, and I think it's late in the evening for you.
Oh, yeah. Good morning, though. Good morning.
Right. So how has 2021 been so far? How did the year begin for you?
The 2021 in the United States has really been highlighted or lowlighted by two features. One, the ongoing crisis with COVID, which continues to be a real crisis in the United States. And now we have the twin crisis of a constitutional crisis in the United States with the actions of the president and his inciting an insurrection that really cuts to the core of American ideals of democracy. And for me, hit very close to home because the images that I see are places I used to work in. Exactly. And so to see that so directly, this really symbol of democracy in the United States, the White House was always a symbol of power, but the Capitol building was always a symbol of democracy. And to see it breached and tarnished and disrespected like that is really shakes every American because we never thought that could happen, and now we know it can.
Absolutely. It was extremely shocking, and and to think of it, a sitting president inciting something like this is unpardonable, I think.
Yes, it's just tragic days here. We're hoping to get through it.
In fact, that was one of the questions I had, actually. You've been working there for 13 years, isn't it? And I'm sure it must have been extremely traumatic for you to see those ugly scenes unfold like that.
Yes, Washington's always had a special place for me, not just because I worked there as a journalist covering political issues, but a person who, you know, pays a lot of attention to politics and wants our citizens to be heard. And it is very important for our citizens to be heard. So there's nothing wrong with a protest. A
Right.
peaceful protest is a hallmark of democracy, but what we're dealing with now is a denial of facts and an unwillingness to accept facts. And in doing so, they're creating theories and conspiracies and essentially inciting people who believe those theories to act against every American ideal. So it is a very troubling time here.
True, true. Now, in your long career as a political journalist, what was the one story that you found particularly challenging or difficult to work on?
There was several that were difficult. One that was difficult logistically was when the United States sent the military into Haiti
Hmm.
in 1994. I went in with the Marines into Haiti. So I spent about 4 or 5 weeks there. So being embedded and trying to understand the dynamics of a country that, as much as you want to learn, if you're not there, you really don't know a country, until you spend time in it. So
Right.
that was challenging and exhilarating. Another story that I found discomforting was the President Clinton crisis with Monica Lewinsky and that scandal. I thought the president didn't look good in it. I don't think the Republican opposition looked good in it. And I don't think we as journalists did a very good job. And I have to put my hand up there because I was right in the middle of it. So
Right.
I look at stories like that or events like that, and I hope that they demonstrate something valuable. And in
Mhm.
that instance, I don't think anybody came out looking valuable or worthy.
Right, right. I read that you got to speak to her and she hung up on you just before the scandal broke out, isn't it?
Yeah, the day before, to say speak is a pretty short word. There was very few words. Hi, I'm Tom Galvin. I'm a journalist. Well, she answered the phone, and then once she knew who I was, and I don't blame her. That's
Right,
her right.
right,
Uh, you know, a free press means you have the right to answer questions. It also means you have the responsibility to act responsible. And
right,
it also means the people you want to ask questions to have the right to tell you, I don't want to answer. So I always respected that part of it.
right. So how different are the Republicans from the Democrats as far as you see?
The differences used to be small.
Mhm.
Uh, I've studied other countries and politics in other countries. And for example, Germany, they had a
Mhm.
very big Green Party that didn't want a military budget at all. That's a
Mhm.
big difference between Christian Democrats or others.
Mhm.
In the United States, it was always a question of whether we should have an $800 billion budget for the military or a $900 million budget for the military. And they would fight over that 100 million like it really was 100 billion, like it was really a big difference, when in fact, there was really just degrees. So for a long time, there wasn't that much difference. And whenever the difference is little, people fight over small things. It's just human nature. Now the differences are clear, and the Trump's party is really not a conservative party. There's a political commentator who put it best, which is the Republican Party used to be a conservative party with a fringe nationalist element.
Mhm.
And now it's a nationalist party with a fringe conservative element. I'm really hopeful that the Republican Party can refine its place because it's very important. It's vital that we
Right.
have multiple parties and people have choices. As a journalist, I found myself, I'm neither a Democrat or a Republican. I'm an independent, and I tend to vote for people, not parties.
Mhm.
So I'm anxious to see a Republican Party rebuilt because it's an integral part of democracy.
Right, fair enough. Now, whenever you meet with politicians or presidential candidates, they're usually wary of journalists. What is the one thing that they are particularly wary of or too cautious to speak about?
The biggest difference between a presidential candidate and a politician, and I saw this because I knew presidential candidates before, pardon me, politicians who became presidential candidates, they become so cautious. So they go from being their natural selves, which is how they got in the position to have that opportunity, to containing themselves so hard because they're fearful of any mistake that they lose their humanity and they lose the attractiveness that got them there. Those who've been able to avoid that, Bill Clinton is a good example because he was a natural politician who didn't lose that when he ran, tend to do best. But I've seen multiple politicians struggle with that. George W. Bush is a good example of someone who didn't fall into that trap. And Joe Biden is someone who's, it's impossible for Joe Biden to be anyone but Joe Biden. Good and bad, Joe Biden is going to be Joe Biden. And he's going to be very authentic. So the main thing I found that was different between them is they just became so wound, so tight, and so cautious that I thought in some respects it was self-defeating to their candidacy.
Right. That's unfortunate. If they lose the charm and the appeal that got them there, then yes. What's the point? You're trying to be someone else then.
Exactly. And that was always Hillary Clinton's challenge. She's a remarkable woman with great skills, but you never got a sense that she trusted her authentic self. So she was always trying on a character to see if that would be what people liked. And if you do that too often, the authenticity gets lost. And I think that's really what she struggled with when she was running for president both times, was being her authentic self.
Right. You've had such a long and a distinguished career as a political journalist. Then you transitioned to the corporate world, became head of corporate communications at Cisco. What was the most thrilling or challenging aspect of that?
I found that going from being a journalist to going into the corporate side of the world of communications was, as a journalist, your job was to find problems, and it was someone else's job to solve them.
Right.
When I went into communications, I realized that it was our job to find the solutions to the problems the journalists were pointing out. So it really went from identifying problems to finding solutions. And that's a challenge, but it was also a really great challenge because it required thought and credibility and creativity. So that was the biggest change that I found between the two.
Oh, yeah. But how did you find the time? I mean, as a journalist, I'm sure you could write open editorials, blogs, articles. It's all part of the game. But then when you moved to being in the corporate sector, how did you find the time to write?
Well, I think if you're a writer, you always write. You know, I have children, and I've always said, they're older now, that your passion is what you do when you can do anything.
Right.
So there's times when we all have to work. There's times we have family responsibilities or whatever else that is, volunteering. But then when we have our spare time, what do we do? And I've always believed that what we do in those are actually our real passions. So even as a journalist, I was a writer. In corporate communications, I wrote a lot as in corporate communications, and always found time to try to write on the more creative side.
Right. So you've written in multiple genres. So you've written short stories, you've written novel, you've written open air editorials, blogs. Which is your most favored genre? What is your most at ease genre?
I would say there's a difference between I like the most and what I think I'm better at. I don't find op-eds, an 800-word advocacy piece, to be difficult to write. You got to get a good idea, and it's always challenging to do it the best you can. But there's a way to do that. The thing I found very challenging, and I feel like all writers are still learning, that each time you write or you edit a book or you do whatever it is, it's like another class, and I didn't think about this, and now I have to worry about how I do this or how I make sure the characters' voices are distinct, or all those elements. Is the thing I love about writing fiction is you just get inside yourself and you kind of disappear into the story.
Right.
And I kind of view a novel like a beautiful garden that you get to visit. And when you're there, it's the most beautiful place in the world. And the hard part about finishing a novel is once you're done, you can only look at that garden in pictures. You can't actually go there because you're done. You're no longer going to the garden. You can only remember that you have memories of the garden, but you can't go. So I think a lot of writers find a certain level of sadness at the completion of a book. And I think one of the reasons is that is it's the ability to go and live in the moment and actually be outside yourself. And all of a sudden you look up and it's been 45 minutes and you realize you've had no constant, no aspect of time because of that.
Right, fair enough. How long have you been writing? When did you take to writing, actually?
Well, as a journalist, of course, I was writing quite a lot, but I didn't plan to be a journalist. I was actually in school a Soviet studies major. I thought I was going to spend my time analyzing and understanding the Soviet Union. But when I was in graduate school, I needed a part-time job, and so I became an editorial assistant at a Washington publication, and I really realized that I loved it. So I kind of fell into it in that way. So I've always written, even back when I was younger. Certainly as a journalist I did, and different aspects of it. But I began writing from a fiction standpoint I wrote a movie treatment in 1997, concept for a movie. I took on my first book in 2000 which was a fictionalized version of my family history,
right,
from Ireland. And really this idea for immigrants in the United States, for me, Irish, are you Irish or are you American? Because trying to make that decision for an immigrant who's come, what is your identity?
Right.
Was something I really enjoyed exploring. And it could be Irish, it could be Indian, it could be Hungarian, it can be any immigrant faces that duality.
Right.
And it was really about how do you face that duality and what choices do you make?
That's interesting. Is the book available?
No, my first lesson in journalism or in novel writing was I became obsessed with making it accurate. And I don't mean a level of accuracy that was ridiculous. And so I have to go back. I learned lessons moving on from that book. I have it written. I need to go back and get over myself on accuracy. But it's done, and at some point I'll publish that.
Okay, that's we definitely look forward to, because hyphenated existence and the problems and associations with identities is always intriguing. It's
yes, I really enjoy the idea of identity. The auction covers a lot about what is your identity, because it's a futuristic story that's really designed around, in a world where, what is our value?
Right.
And in what I increasingly see with algorithms and everything else is people's value are being placed purely financial.
Absolutely.
What is your actual value beyond that?
Right.
And the auction really explores this idea of what happens when we live in a cutthroat world where your only value is your financial value. And what is your identity in that world?
How long did you take to write the auction?
It's been 5 years, but I had to take time off for some medical issues. So there was a gap. I wrote a book, I wrote the auction, and then I got feedback that I should make changes. So I rewrote the book. I rewrote 70% of it.
Wow.
So the one thing I would tell anybody who wants to write a book is the first version may not be the final version.
True.
In concept or anything else. And I'm not talking about proofing and editing. But conceptually, the first book I wrote on the auction is very different than the one I came out with. And that was thankfully by people who took an interest in it. And they actually took an interest in it. This may never happen, but they took an interest in it as a TV miniseries. And they, based on that, said, here's things I think you should think about doing. And when I listened to them, I was like, wow, I think they're absolutely right. I think the challenge for a writer is you're going to get a lot of advice and be able to know what is good advice,
right,
and what is just advice, right? It's all well-meaning, but I've had instances with the auction where I got very good advice by someone I really respect and made it much better. And then I had an agent who I felt was trying to push me to be a different type of writer.
Right.
To have her be my agent, she wanted me to make these changes, and I started to make them, and I started to not like the book. And I realized, no, there's times when you got to listen and there's times when you have to say no. And knowing the difference between those two, I think, is part of the education of being a writer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, who is your favorite character in the auction?
Well, I love Sasha because she's the main character, and she's a 22-year-old who comes from great privilege and has the world at her feet, but it's not a path she wants to take. So the story is really one of her resisting the obvious path
Hmm.
and then getting caught between two different worlds, one of which is she doesn't like a world where at 22 everyone gets evaluated and then they essentially get purchased by one of the seven large companies that dominate the United States. So she's very valuable to them because she's famous, but she has no interest in her fame. It wasn't earned, it was her mother. The best way to think in the United States is like a JFK Jr. You know, his father was very famous and he became famous because of his father. She's kind of that person. So she resists it, but then essentially gets blackmailed, coerced by her father to do things, including a reality show based on her family's bankrupt. And nobody knows that, but she essentially has to do it to save her family and becomes the face of the auction. So she becomes the face of the thing she hates.
Okay.
While at the same time, not unlike some things that are going on in the United States now, there's a rising protest movement against by the people who are being left behind. Because if you're valuable, you're going to get protected. But if you're not valuable, you get discarded. And ultimately in the auction, it's worse. You actually get eliminated because you're not valuable. So who cares? So there's a kind of a rising protest movement, and she's the face of an auction she hates, and she has to make a choice ultimately between those two worlds. And I'm glad to say she doesn't make a choice between the two. She finds her own way, which is separate from those. But her father, there's a lot of the relationship between her and her father is not a particularly good person. And ultimately, it's her finding her own voice, her own identity in a way that is really the talk of the story. There's other characters I really like. A young man who's also comes from privilege, but is lazy and doesn't really have any talent. And he kind of uses his connections, but along the way comes to realize it. And he makes a big sacrifice in the story where he essentially gives up everything he has, including someone he really loves, because he comes to realize that he's got to do something bigger in his life. And so I like that character, the way that character develops.
It's very, very interesting.